Okay, welcome back. And if you recall, we are in chapter 4, and this is going to be part 2 of chapter 4. So we still have a lot to cover. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So now we're going to talk a little bit about developmental theories. So developmental theories propose that individuals mature physically, cognitively, and emotionally. And kind of keeping that in mind, physical development, we know, like height and weight, etc. This is something that can be charted by a pediatrician, right? Intellectual development, however, is measured by a variety of different intelligence tests and is charted against a normal curve of development. Emotional or social development also progresses at a predictable and normal pace, although it may be a little bit more difficult to measure that. Let's go ahead and kind of move on here. So Jean Piaget believed that individuals go through stages of cognitive or intellectual growth that is related to their moral awareness. Now, in this particular study, she studied the rules that children develop, when they were playing. And that's how she kind of came up with some of her ideas. Now, by definition, developmental theory, just so we can get the definition out of the way, psychological theories that identify and chart a person's normal growth phases in areas such as morality and emotional maturity. Okay, so that's the definition. Now, we talk about different stages. So Kohlberg developed basically moral stages, and those stages consist of different levels of moral reasoning with 2 stages in each level, and we're going to look at those in just a second. And according to Kohlberg and his colleagues, each stage involves qualitative differences in the way that individuals see the world. Cognitive development and moral development are integrated. That is, one must grow intellectually to achieve a higher moral stage. And in this kind of stage theory, if you will, and it's Kohlberg's moral stage theory, one cannot skip stages. They're kind of hierarchical, meaning one is before the other, etc. However, some people will not advance to the highest stage. So again, these are just kind of, this defines Kohlberg's moral stage theory. So let's look at some of those quickly. So this is stage 1, and this is the pre-conventional level. And basically here the person approaches a moral issue motivated purely by interest. The major concern is the consequence of the action for this person. So young children first start sharing when they perceive benefit to themselves, such as giving someone their doll in exchange for a game or a ball, etc. Or they kind of grudgingly share because they fear punishment. Okay, so stage 1 would be, the punishment obedience, and so on. And then the part 2 would be the instrument relativity orientation. So at the conventional level, people perceive themselves as members of society, and living up to role responsibilities is paramount, believing oneself to be good. Now, children enter this level when they can basically play with other children according to rules. And, games and play are basically training grounds for moral development because they teach the child and help them define roles and rules of behavior. Okay, so for instance, a game of softball becomes kind of a microcosm of real life when that child actually realizes that he or she is not only acting as self, but also as first baseman, a role that includes certain tasks. So children learn to kind of submerge individual interest to conform to rules and role expectations. So these are the two stages that fall within that conventional level. Okay, and then you can kind of go back and you can look here, kind of to shorten all that up. Level 1 is approach to moral issues motivated by personal interest. Level 2, as we talked about, is approach to moral issues motivated by socialization. And then finally, number 3 would be the post-conventional level. And here a person moves beyond the norms and laws of society to kind of look at, determine universal good. That is the good for everybody, right? And few people reach this level, and their actions are observedly different from the majority. So this is an approach to moral issues motivated by desire to discover that, what's good for everyone, beyond your own self, or society. And finally, Kohlberg actually kind of advanced this a little bit, and kind of, there was a possible 7th stage, which has been described as kind of a soft stage of ethical awareness with an orientation of cosmic or religious thinking. Now, we're not going to go into that. It's easier just to kind of understand this at the 3 different levels. Okay, so now we're gonna kind of back up a little bit. Also know, we talked about Kohlberg's theory. Understand that sometimes there's criticism. So before we get into these individual influences really quick, Kohlberg had been criticized for focusing too much on the concept of justice, ignoring other aspects of morality. Now, in fact, it's argued that the way he defines moral development is kind of culturally biased, reflecting only Judeo-Christian concepts of morality. He's been criticized for focusing too much on rational thinking as opposed to emotional aspects of morality. Now, there has also been research that indicates that the stages are not necessarily kind of a overall really good explanation for people's moral beliefs. And then finally, one other criticism to kind of look at is that his research can be described as kind of sexually biased because he interviewed mostly boys in his early research. Okay, so just a couple of, we know that there's all these different theories and different things, and we know there's people that are okay with them and understand them, believe them, and then there are some that, of course, criticize. All right, so now we want to kind of look at the different individual influences. But let's summarize quickly what we kind of talked about. So, kind of in summary, leading up to now, individual explanations of ethical decision making and behavior. We looked at, evolutionary and genetic elements. The specific biological markers that have implications for morality we talked about that include possibly brain chemicals like oxytocin, with some even going so far as to call it the moral molecule. If you remember, that was the author Zach. Now, individual differences in behavior, were also explained through some, psychological theories. Specifically, we looked at learning theory and moral development theory. There is strong evidence that both rational and emotional components to decision making exist when one is faced with an ethical dilemma. Now, there is also mixed research as to whether a person's beliefs and values actually predict their behavior. Research has found that people may believe the right thing is, to do is one thing, and act in a different way entirely. And part of the reason for this may lie in some of those external influences that we're going to talk about now. So here we go. So we're going to start with, we're going to start with individual, but we're going to kind of talk about all of these. So most people would agree that when a person enters the working world, their ethical and value systems are pretty well established, because you're kind of older then, right, when you start working. And it is also the case, however, that individuals sometimes behave in ways that are contrary to what they believe, or their belief systems may actually change when they're exposed, right, to these different influences. I mean, think of peer pressure, right? Now, we learned a little bit from Bandura before, but here's a little bit more. Bandura sees social and moral maturity as constantly changing and kind of reacting to outside influences, including, family, peers, and even these social institutions. And these external influences really affect our ethical decision making even into adulthood. So with that being said, we're going to kind of take a peek at each one of these individually. Okay. So kind of staying with Bandura a little bit, he sees that social and moral maturity as, constantly changing and reacting to these different influences that we're going to talk about. So let's kind of look at some of the different mechanisms as he talks about, the fact that he believed that individuals develop their moral identity through reinforcement, the development of empathy, let's say, strengthening oneself's regulatory ability, for self-control. He argues that this self-regulation can also be turned off, leading to, deviance or different things. Okay. So here are some of Bandura's mechanisms. Okay. The different influence. So he talks about moral justification. This is an appeal to a higher or more important end to justify the wrong act. Okay. Euphemistic labeling. By using words that downplay the seriousness of actions, the true moral nature of such actions is ignored. Advantageous comparison. This is an argument that the action may be wrong, but it isn't as bad as some others. Displacement of responsibility. This argument basically removes the individual as the free-thinking agent of his or her own actions and basically denies culpability. Diffusion of responsibility. In this situation, the individual can redefine his or her responsibility. Disregard or distortion of the consequences. So by misidentifying the consequences of one's actions, you could basically deny responsibility for harm. And then finally, dehumanization. Humans feel the most sympathy or empathy for those who are closest to us, and we feel the least for those who are, most unlike us. Therefore, dehumanization strips the victim of any qualities of similarity that may create sympathy, etc. Okay, so now let's kind of move on, and we're going to learn a couple of definitions, and then as I promised, we're going to jump right into those different areas. So again, we're still talking about the work group and organizational influence. So, others besides Bandura have explained how individuals may engage in unethical behavior. And a couple of authors by the name of Bazerman and Ted Brunsell present the concept of bounded ethicality. And this refers to the cognitive structure whereby decisions are interpreted using variables that do not include ethics. So, often in the context of a group decision-making process, for instance, in that Ford Pinto case a long time ago, if you guys know what a Ford Pinto is, if you're really old, you do, where the automobiles company executives estimated that it would be less costly to pay a couple of wrongful death lawsuits than issue a recall for the car. The decision was made purely economic without any consideration given to the morality of knowing some victims would die because of the faulty design of the Ford Pinto. And then in some decision making, there's something called ethical fading. And this occurs whereby the ethical ramifications of the decision choices may be addressed initially, but over time they kind of become removed from the decision-making process. And these forces are incredibly powerful when operating, kind of as a group, and it influence, in that group influence, and could account for a lot of the atrocities that were committed in the name of justice in some of these other, things that have happened over many, many years. So this kind of removes that ethical decision, right? At first, you kind of jump on it, you're paying attention to it, etc. People initially look at it, and then it kind of, over time, it kind of slowly fades away, and you drop a particular ethical element of that discussion, and then it removes that ethical decision. Okay, so now we'll talk about ethical climate and organizational justice. So a growing body of research explores the ability to measure the ethical climate of an organization. So research shows that leadership, the reward structure, and organizational messages can also affect that ethical climate. Now, Victor and Cullen in 1988 discovered that there are significant differences in the ethical climates even within one organization. And these researchers identified theoretical scales indicating the primary vehicle of decision making as the following. Okay, self-interest, company profit, friendship, team interest, social responsibility, personal morality, company rules, procedures, and then laws and professional codes. So they also identified three basic ethical orientations: egoism, benevolence, and principle, which would be kind of ethical formalism. Okay, so then we're going to talk about training quickly. The Enron fraud and bankruptcy scandal prompted the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 that held CEOs responsible for the actions of their employees. Now, the act spurred the emergence of ethics courses and compliance officers in that particular business. The question is whether ethics training is actually effective. And Kohlberg again described the following as necessities for moral growth. So we talked about being in a situation where seeing things from other points of view is encouraged, engaging in logical thinking, having the responsibility to make moral decisions and influence the moral world, being exposed to moral controversy and to conflict, being exposed to the reasoning of individuals whose thinking is kind of a stage higher than yours, and then participating in creating and maintaining a just community whose members pursue common goals. Now, with that, just know that most professional schools today, in law, medicine, business, policing, corrections, etc., the courts, require at least one class in professional ethics. And typically, these classes present the opportunity to examine the ethical dilemmas that individuals might encounter as members of that profession, and help students discover the best way to decide ethical dilemmas. Now, we know, and there are differences between ethics courses in a college environment and training courses that are offered at organizations. And keep in mind that most UCs and Cal State colleges are now requiring some type of ethics course. Now, again, when it comes to law enforcement, etc., there are several ethics courses that are going to need to be taken. Okay, so kind of moving on now and talking about leadership. So if there is a culture of impropriety or a pattern of transgressions in any organization, really we look to the leader for fault. There are thousands of articles and books about leadership. Researchers identify, typologies and deconstruct different type of leadership styles. For example, task versus people-oriented leadership, participative, authoritarian, technocratic, charismatic leadership, and so on. And we cannot do justice to leadership studies here, really, but it is important to note that the concepts of authentic leadership and transformational leadership seem to be very relevant to our discussion on, ethics and organizations. And research has also shown that leadership styles that incorporate, these elements are associated with higher levels of job satisfaction and organizational commitment, satisfaction with supervision, extra effort, lower turnover, organizational behavior is better, and better overall employee performance, and even reductions in cynicism towards the organization. Now, in one study, it was found that transformational leadership was correlated with a higher stage moral reasoning of leaders. However, that pseudo transformational leadership really, is kind of questionable. But those pseudo transformational leaders were those who, talked the talk, but they didn't walk the walk of actual transformational leadership. They fully didn't invest themselves, but those that did saw many, many better things happening within their own organization. Okay. All right. So, the first thing to really note is that for a leader to influence ethical behavior among employees, they really have to act ethically themselves. If a leader engages in unethical behavior, it is highly unlikely that ethical behavior of employees is going to be the result, right? So research has shown that, the correlates, if you will, of leaders who make unethical decisions include the following. Okay, so they are very proactive and goal-oriented, but not concerned about potential problems. They are self-directed and make their own decisions, but not prone to take or seek advice from anybody else. So again, we're talking about those things that correlate with unethical decisions. They want to be in charge and have a high achievement orientation. They are likely to have their own rules and are willing to tell others to follow them. And then finally, they have a low interest or, kind of a not a very good filter, if you will, for people. Now, on the flip side, what then would be advice to leaders who would like to advance ethical decision making and emphasize the importance of organizational support, etc.? So ethical leaders should create an environment conducive to dignified treatment on the job, increase ethical awareness, avoid deception and manipulation, allow for openness, and free flow of unclassified information, foster a sense of shared values, demonstrate an obligation to honesty, fairness, and decency, and discuss issues of corruption publicly. Be transparent. You've probably heard that phrase before, right? And then kind of along with what we've already talked about, Metz in 1990 offers similar advice, but he kind of goes a little bit further. He talks about establishing realistic goals, providing that ethical leadership, have a written code. And in law enforcement, we have the Law Enforcement Code of Ethics. Provide a mechanism for people to tell you what's happening. Discipline violators for ethical standard violations, and then train people. And if you don't know what the Law Enforcement Code of Ethics is, I would really suggest that you read it, because you know what? This is not as easy to follow as you actually think. So take time to really read this and see if you can do this. Okay. Or, some departments actually have what we call mission and value statements, things that are important to the organization. All right, and then finally we have these societal and cultural influences. So organizational culture is subjected to external influences, and we know that. External influences are both objective, which would be laws and regulations that constrain that organization, and normative, which would be those public belief systems. And we see these external influences operating in for-profit organizations as well as public service organizations like those within criminal justice. So, and in here, messages will filter from the public to the organization in terms of what will be tolerated and what will not be, if that kind of makes sense, okay? Now, in your book, there's some information on a particular case in one of the little boxes to read in, but one of the ethical issues or illustrations in your book shows how law enforcement organizations are influenced and must respond to larger social events. So, for instance, it could be immigration, right? That's a big issue. And a couple of other issues early on, the Michael Brown shooting in Ferguson in 2014, the death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Maryland, shortly afterward sparked a very strong public backlash against police use of force, especially against minority men. And this backlash took a violent turn when several police officers were later ambushed and killed, supposedly in retaliation for the police killings. Now, again, in that box that we're talking about in your textbook, it highlights one chief who basically was hailed as a hero for handling of an incident that occurred in Dallas. Now, just a little bit more, this external pressure on police organization really has spurred leaders to improve training, tighten up use of force policies, and improve discipline systems. Public pressure has also spurred the discussion of things like body cameras, citizen review panels, and special prosecutors. And even the Department of Justice began or has, kind of continued numerous investigations that have led to consent decrees, if you will, or consent orders, and agreements with cities across the country designed to help improve police policies. All right. So these are all things that, when we talk about, being transparent and addressing issues head on. Okay. So now, while much of the research that has been done in management science applies to criminal justice organizations, we should never lose sight of the unique elements that make up the role of criminal justice professionals. And part of the questions that you should ask yourself within these confines would be, do I believe in the Constitution? Do I believe in the Bill of Rights? And do I truly believe in the sanctity and natural right of due process? All right, so we made it right at the 30-minute mark, so that's actually not too bad. So this is going to conclude part 2 of chapter 4, Becoming an Ethical Professional. And again, read, I showed it to you when the Law Enforcement Code of Ethics. Take the time to really look at that and see if that is something that you could actually live up to. So that'll conclude our lecture, our part 2 lecture for today.